Hey everyone, this is a piece by Kirstin Munro. It's from the Marx Key Concepts book, edited by Riccardo Bellafiore and Tommaso Rodolfi Riva. The piece is titled Social Reproduction. Section 1, Introduction. Over the past 5 decades, Marxist feminist theorizing has been hampered by confusions over the multiple meanings of, quote, reproduction, end quote. See Barrett, 1980. Overcoming the haziness with which these concepts are too often treated is especially urgent given the current popularity of social reproduction theory, a recent offshoot of Marxist feminism. The potential for misunderstanding is exacerbated by the existence of an additional use of the term, quote, social reproduction, end quote, outside of Marxist scholarship, in a Bourdieu-influenced subfield in education scholarship. I argue that precision in the application of political economic categories related to reproduction is not merely desirable for precision's sake. These categories lose their critical explanatory power when applied carelessly. The reproduction of capitalist society as a whole, that is, social reproduction, cannot be examined without an understanding of the contribution of the reproduction of labor power and the reproduction of capital to social reproduction. Indeed, the concepts of labor power and the reproduction of capital from Marx's critique of political economy are meaningless if divorced from their explicit roles in the perpetuation of capitalist society as a whole, and from their recursive relationship to each other in the reproduction of capitalist social relations of production. In this chapter, I define these concepts drawing on Marx and Marxist feminism, use these definitions to demonstrate the relationship between these concepts and show how these concepts have been misapplied in some strains of recent Marxist feminist research. Finally, I discuss the consequences of the incorrect application of these concepts. Section 2, the intergenerational transmission of status and culture. Prior to the recent popularity of the new Marxist feminist-inspired offshoot, Bhattacharya, 2017, Ferguson, 1919, 1999, 2019, the term social reproduction theory was primarily used to describe a particular strand of research in the field of education influenced by Bourdieu. See Bourdieu and Passerson.
Are you sure you're okay about doing honors? Huh? Are you sure you're okay about doing honors?
I'm outside, so you'll hear other people talking. Pierre Bourdieu, who lived from 1930 to 2002, was a French sociologist and public intellectual. Bourdieu's contributions to the sociology of education, the theory of sociology, and the sociology of aesthetics have achieved wide influence in several related academic fields, e.g. anthropology, media, cultural studies, education, popular culture, and the arts. During his academic career, he was primarily associated with the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris and the Collège de France. Bourdieu's work was primarily concerned with the dynamics of power in society, especially the diverse and subtle ways in which power is transferred and social order is maintained within and across generations. In conscious opposition to the idealist tradition of much Western philosophy, Bourdieu's work often emphasizes the corporeal nature of social life and stresses the role of practice and embodiment in social dynamics. Building upon and criticizing the theories of Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Erwin Panofsky, and Marcel Mauss, among others, Bourdieu's research pioneered novel investigative frameworks and methods and introduced such influential concepts as cultural, social, and symbolic forms of capital, as opposed to traditional economic forms of capital, the cultural reproduction, the habitus and field or location, and symbolic violence. Another notable influence on Bourdieu was Blaise Pascal, after whom Bourdieu titled his Pascalian Meditations. Bourdieu was a prolific author, producing hundreds of articles and 36 books, nearly all of which are now available in English. His best-known work is Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, published in 1979, in which he argues that judgments of taste are related to social position, or more precisely, are themselves acts of social positioning. The argument is put forward by an original combination of social theory and data from quantitative surveys, photographs, and interviews, in an attempt to reconcile difficulties such as how to understand the subject within objective structures. In the process, Bourdieu attempts to reconcile the influence of both external and social structures and subjective experience on the individual. The book was named, quote, the sixth most important sociological work of the 20th century, end quote, by the International Sociological Association. Pierre Bourdieu's work emphasizes how social classes, especially the ruling and intellectual classes, preserve their social privileges across generations, despite the myth that contemporary post-industrial society boasts equality of opportunity and high social mobility achieved through formal education. So much for Bourdieu. Back to the text. These writings focus on how cultural reproduction, the intergenerational transmission of status, identity, and culture via institutions such as formal education, contributes to the reproduction of society as a whole via symbolic relationships between classes, end quote, the distribution of cultural capital, end quote, among these classes. Quote, classes, end quote, here being something more akin to Weberian social classes rather than Marxist classes. And while words such as, quote, reproduction and, quote, capital may have Marxist connotations, these theories of cultural reproduction are more accurately linked to Durkheim and his notion of, quote, the conservation of a culture inherited from the past, end quote, from his writings on education, that is, quote, the transmission from generation to generation of accumulated information, end quote, Bourdieu, 1973. While Bourdieu is critical of the role of educational institutions in the socialization of students into social classes, Durkheim is a, quote, defender of the bourgeois social order and sees this process as a good thing. Moreover, Bourdieu specifically draws a distinction between his own theory and that of Durkheim, as Durkheim does not emphasize the link between cultural reproduction and social reproduction. That is, the reproduction of society as a whole, while Bourdieu is concerned with how societies reproduce themselves via culture. See Desson, 2013. There's some footnotes here that I missed. Footnote 1. Some authors in this field move away from any concept of class entirely, preferring instead to discuss dominant and subordinate cultures. End footnote. Next footnote. Some scholars who use social reproduction theory as developed in the field of education claim that it draws on Marxist roots. See E.G. Collins, 2009, and Giraud, 1983. And I don't know if I've already skipped this over this footnote already, but I'm going to read it as if I did. Footnote. Sometimes the, quote, social, end quote, is literally dropped, for example, by Fergus, 2016, who discusses, quote, reproduction theory, end quote, in the context of the transmission of teachers' beliefs and racial prejudices. End footnote. As absorbed into the field of education research, however, the focus has become the dominating effect of education and how it leads to cultural reproduction and accumulation of cultural capital by individuals who can cash it in. So while these theorists in education follow Bourdieu in critiquing this process of cultural transmission of identity and status, it is in some ways a more strictly Durkheimian application, dropping the, quote, social, end quote, in, quote, social reproduction theory, end quote, by de-emphasizing the role of these acculturation processes in the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole. Rather, the emphasis is on an unfair initial distribution of, quote, cultural capital, end quote, which is intensified by educational institutions, leading to the persistence of inequality in advantaged and disadvantaged Weberian socioeconomic classes, or dominant and subordinate, quote, cultures, end quote, stratified by race and gender. Later developments in social reproduction theory and education build on Giraud's 1983 critique of the, quote, reproduction thesis, end quote, in education as being excessively Marxist, economistic, and deterministic. None of this, however, can tell us anything about how, quote, societies ... perpetuate themselves, end quote. See Collins, 2009. This brief discussion of the term, quote, social reproduction theory, end quote, as used in the field of education has been included here because the existence of two distinct social reproduction theories, one Marxist feminist and one Durkheimian, has the potential to cause confusion as words can mean more than one thing. This usage of social reproduction in the field of education research to mean the intergenerational transmission of status and culture will be set aside for the remainder of the chapter, as it is unrelated to Marx or Marxist usages, and the phrase, quote, social reproduction theory, end quote, going forward will refer to the recent Marxist feminist offshoot. Footnote. One possible additional source of confusion is the elements of Marxist feminist social reproduction theorist Sears's 2017 work, which in part concerns socialization and the transmission of heteronormativity and gay identity, and Susan Ferguson's work on childhood and education, both of which draw on this other version of social reproduction theory from the field of education. End footnote. Forgive me. I was thirsty. Alright. New section. Section 3. Biological reproduction. In the context of radical feminism, or a dual systems approach to Marxist feminism, biological reproduction and the capacity to give birth are central to understandings of women's oppression in a transhistorical notion of, quote, patriarchy, end quote. However, Mark Cousins writes that, quote, the argument that a theory of reproduction must include childbirth is based simply upon a pun. It is one thing to list what every child knows is necessary for the continuation of an economy. It is quite another to give any one of them a discursive priority in relation to the problem of reproduction, end quote. Cousins, 1978. Thus, the use of the term, quote, reproduction, end quote, by Marxist feminists is fraught with danger as, quote, it tends to conflate the biological reproduction of the species with the historically specific question of ... the reproduction of ... labor power and in maintaining the relations of dominance and subordinacy of capitalist production, end quote. Barrett, 1980. At its worst, this conflation results in biologically determinist theories of women's oppression in capitalist society and the gender division of labor. See Arruzza, A-R-R-U-Z-Z-A, 2016. There's a footnote I missed. Dual systems or socialist feminist approaches are those that combine aspects of radical feminism and Marxism to theorize gender-based oppression as the result of two systems, patriarchy and capitalism. See Young, 1981, for a seminal critique of dual systems approaches, and Vogel, 1981. See Young, 1981, for a seminal critique of dual systems approaches, and Vogel, 1981, in the same book for a critical history of the, quote, socialist feminist synthesis, end quote. End footnote. When Marx writes that the, quote, seller of labor power must perpetuate himself, quote, in the way that every living individual perpetuates himself by procreation, end quote, Marx is not referring to just any biological procreation, but rather to the replenishment of the, quote, race of peculiar commodity owners, end quote, in order to, quote, perpetuate its appearance in the market, end quote. Marx, 1867, I'm going to guess that's Capital. Capital was published in 1867. Capital Volume 1. Section 4. The reproduction of labor power. Labor power is, quote, the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being, which he exercises whenever he produces a use value of any description, end quote. Footnote. In order to successfully produce use values, the capacity to produce use values that exist in a human being actualized as labor must be combined with means of production that likewise must possess the capacity to produce use values. End footnote. Labor power only becomes a commodity when labor power is offered for sale on the market. The commodity labor power is sold by the bearer of labor power, the free laborer, because he has nothing else to sell as the result of the historical process of forcible expropriation. The existence of the capitalist necessitates the existence of the seller of labor power, and the imperative of accumulation necessitates that labor power remains constantly available on the market. While he viewed the reproduction of labor power as a key component of the reproduction of capitalist society, Marx, quote, never provides a thoroughgoing exposition of just what it entailed, end quote. See Vogel, 1983. Thus precisely how labor power, this peculiar commodity, is replenished with fresh labor power both day-to-day and intergenerationally, has been a focus of Marxist feminist scholarship for over 50 years, as have debates over the specific relationship of these activities to the production of surplus value. The classical theory of wage determination states that, quote, the natural price of labor is that price which is necessary to enable the laborers one with another to subsist and to perpetuate their race, end quote. Ricardo, 1817. Or for Marx that, quote, the value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of the laborer, end quote. Marx. Ricardo writes that the wage is dependent on, but not exactly equal to, the money price of the commodities the wage worker and their household need to survive, and Marx argues that, at its minimum level of subsistence, the value of the commodity labor power is, quote, determined by the value of the commodities without the daily supply of which the laborer cannot renew his vital energy, end quote. Marx. 1867, Capital Volume 1. However, in making the simplifying jump from the means of subsistence generically, to the value of commodities specifically, both Ricardo and Marx bypass the fact that commodities must be transformed in order to serve as final use values, that is, before they are consumed. Though this production process frequently takes place in family households, this need not be the case. The quality of unwaged work spent by the working class in this production of use values is dynamic as both a substitute for and complement to commodities purchased with money from wage labor, and thus also impacts upon the range of the ultimate and minimum levels of the value of labor power in terms of commodities. The wage is not exactly equal to the full amount of labor time necessary for the reproduction of labor power day-to-day or intergenerationally because of the unwaged time involved in transforming commodities into use values and raising children. See Quick, 2018, Vogel, 1983. With Lise Vogel, I don't know if it's Lise or Lisa, but it's Lise Vogel, is what I'm going to say. 1983 calls, quote, the domestic component of necessary labor, end quote. State programs such as public education, health care, and other welfare state benefits also contribute to the non-equivalence of the worker's wage and the worker's subsistence level. See Conference of Socialist Economists, 1977, page 4. Just as the wage is not static, so the quantity of unwaged labor and the quantity of welfare state benefits involved in the subsistence of the working class are not static. Understanding the cultural norms that prescribe working class, quote, needs, end quote, the specific proportions of inputs, the social assignment of tasks, and the arrangement of people in space is an empirical question for historians. The reproduction of labor power has been carried out in a variety of ways during the history of capitalism. The imperative of accumulation means that capital must, quote, tend to socialize, that is, turn into a collective activity the general conditions of capitalist accumulation, end quote. See Cockburn, that's Cockburn, 1977. While the focus is frequently on women, households, and household production, and their role in the reproduction of labor power can be replenished via other means, such as proletarianization, and in other sites, such as schools, quote, labor camps, barracks, orphanages, hospitals, prisons, and other such institutions, end quote. Vogel, 1983. One thing that is not clear is whether the unwaged work that goes into this transformation of commodities into final use values by the working class and the reproduction of labor power, when unwaged, more generally represents a subsidy to the capitalist class that allows the realization of higher profits. Some authors, for example, Vogel, suggest that there is no subsidy involved, and in fact the reductions in domestic labor may increase surplus value. Others, such as Dalla Costa and James, 1975, suggest that unwaged work does represent a substitute to the capitalist class. If Vogel's analysis is correct, then from the perspective of the capitalist class, unproductive work involved in reproducing labor power, quote, is simultaneously indispensable and an obstacle to accumulation, end quote. Vogel. Following Brenner and Laslet, 1991, and Brenner, 2000, the recent Marxist feminist offshoot social reproduction theory initially redefined social reproduction as the reproduction of labor power. See Bhattacharya, 2017, without a specific examination of how the reproduction of labor power relates to capitalist society as a whole. Social reproduction theory borrows from Dalla Costa and James, 1975, and the idea that women who perform tasks on an unwaged basis related to the reproduction of labor power are members of the working class and thus capable of participating in class struggle. From Lise Vogel, 1983, social reproduction theory borrows the notion that labor power is reproduced not only in the family household on an unwaged basis by mothers and wives, but also on a waged basis by unproductive workers. In part, borrowing these aspects of 20th century Marxist feminist scholarship, social reproduction theory argues for the working class position and revolutionary capacity of people outside the, quote, productive, end quote, economy, those engaged in either waged or unwaged work related to the reproduction of labor power, if not surplus value directly. While it is gestured towards it in places, this social reproduction theory does not specifically examine how the reproduction of labor power relates to the crisis-ridden reproduction of capitalist society. What is offered instead is a foreshortened account in which exploitation and domination are extrinsic to the organization of production and reproduction, and the activities involved therein. For this reason, social reproduction theory is not a theory of capitalist society, but rather can be best described as a revolutionary strategy aimed at correctly identifying the working class on the assumption that the correct definition can help to bring about communism. More recently, social reproduction theorists such as Alan Sears, 2016-2017, Sugan Ferguson, 2019, and Tithi Bhattacharya have moved away from redefining social reproduction as the reproduction of labor power and have begun to use the term, quote, life-making, end quote. The vague term, quote, life-making, end quote, straddles the line between biological reproduction and the reproduction of labor power. Ferguson argues that capitalism proceeds by, quote, reorganizing and devaluing all of people's life-making activities, most of which have been the tasks assigned to women, end quote. Ferguson, 2019. Social reproduction itself is defined by Bhattacharya as, quote, life-making activities, end quote. Yaffa, 2020. Others in this niche define social reproduction as, quote, the domain of life making, end quote. See Thompson, 2020. Quote, the under-remunerated effort of reproducing use values essential to, quote, life making, end quote, end quote. Rao et al., 2021, page 2. End quote, the renewal and maintenance of life and of the institutions and work necessary therein, end quote. Aruza, 2016. Social reproduction is said to give, quote, a name to the activities that constitute life-making, in capitalist society, end quote. Miranda and Lane McKinley, 2017. The shift by social reproduction theorists from defining social reproduction to meaning the reproduction of labor power to redefining social reproduction to meaning, quote, life-giving, quote, life-making, end quote, generically represents a further evolution in the stripping away of the explanatory political economic power in these Marxist categories as it divorces them from their explicit relationship to capitalist society as a whole. Quote, it substitutes for an economic category a sycophantic phrase, voilà tout, end quote. Quote, it substitutes an economic category for a sycophantic phrase, voilà tout. I don't know what voilà tout means. I guess I could look it up. End quote, Marx. Capital. Voila tout, that is all. So that means, quote, it substitutes for an economic category a sycophantic phrase, that is all, end quote. Marx. While social reproduction theorists may speak about, quote, life-making, end quote, in order to paint these, quote, life-making activities, end quote, and the people who perform them in a virtuous light, the life that is made is a worker who must compete with other workers for the opportunity to sell her labor power, spending the majority of her life maximizing surplus value. Seen in this way, the task of reproductive workers is the reproduction of not just life, but this race of peculiar commodity owners, the sellers of labor power. Thus, the reproduction of labor power in capitalist society is not virtuous, quote, life-making, end quote, but rather one aspect of a larger process that perpetuates the capitalist organization of society. After all, quote, the reproduction of labor power, bracket, is, end bracket, a factor in the reproduction of capital itself. Accumulation of capital is therefore increase of the proletariat, end quote. Marx, 1867, Capital. Section 5. Accumulation and the reproduction of capital. Another aspect of a larger process that perpetuates the capitalist organization of society is accumulation. Labor power cannot be sold on the market without Mr. Moneybags on the other end to buy it. Individual capitalists are compelled to continually buy labor power in order to continually produce commodities for sale on the market, or else face ruin. Surplus value is realized if these commodities are successfully sold for more than the cost to produce them, and the resulting money must be immediately and constantly returned into circulation in order to purchase additional labor power and means of production to begin the cycle again for reproduction on an increasing scale. Quote, by the side of the newly formed capital, the original capital continues to reproduce itself and to produce surplus value, and that this is also true of all accumulated capital and the additional capital engendered by it, end quote. Marx. In this way, quote, the consumption of labor power is at one and the same time the production of commodities and of surplus value, end quote, assuming, of course, that these commodities are sold. This process is portrayed by traditional Marxists as a, quote, theft, end quote, of surplus by, quote, greedy, end quote, capitalists. See Pistone 1993 and Clark 1995, but this is not the case. Quote, it is the market that imposes its capitalist character on each individual capital, ... The action of the individual capitalist is not an expression of his individual will, but of the social character of capital, and its social character is only imposed on the individual capital through its insertion into the sphere of exchange, as the individual capitalist seeks to valorize his capital, end quote. Clark, 1995. I'm not sure what piece this is, but I have at least 2 books by Simon Clark on this channel, including a couple of essays, one of those being Was Lenin a Marxist, and definitely something about from like the state and the state derivation debate, or the topic of the state. Anyway, the individual capitalist, like the individual worker, is compelled to act in particular ways by the market and the imperatives of accumulation, quote, the effect of the social mechanism of which he is but one of the wheels, end quote, Marx, Capital. And besides, workers are being paid the market price of the commodity labor power that they are compelled to sell to capitalists. See Heinrich, 2012. In traditional Marxist theories, class struggle involves workers attempting to recapture a portion of the value created through their labor for their own use and enjoyment, while the capitalist class uses the state as an instrument to allow the continued, quote, theft, end quote, of the surplus. See Pistone, 1993. According to these theories, the short-term amelioration of this theft can be achieved through redistribution of both monetary wealth and political power from capital to workers. This redistribution appears to be conceived of as a stepping stone toward the ultimate end of workers, now broadly defined to also include those engaged in the work of reproducing labor power, seizing power and centrally planning an equitable form of distribution while leaving the existing production processes intact. However, quote, the more or less favorable circumstances in which the working class supports and multiplies itself in no way alter the fundamental character of capitalist production, end quote. Marx, 1867. And improvements in well-being can only be secured within capitalism to the extent that these improvements do not interfere with accumulation. Furthermore, quote, the class struggle over production is not a matter of the subjective motivation of the capitalist, but is imposed on every capitalist by the pressure of competition, which is the expression of the tendency for capitalism to develop the forces of production without regard to the limits of the market, end quote. Simon Clark, 1995. An expanded definition of the working class to include people whose waged and unwaged work contributes to the reproduction of labor power has helped to shed light on previously understudied activities which are not productive of surplus value. However, in examining capitalism from the standpoint of waged and unwaged labor with, quote, good, end quote, workers and, quote, bad, end quote, capitalists, traditional Marxists concerned with the reproduction of labor power have largely refrained from examining how this labor relates to accumulation, and as a consequence, how the reproduction of labor power relates to the whole of capitalist society. Section 6. Reproduction of capitalist society as a whole. Recently, social reproduction theory has attempted to redefine, quote, social reproduction, end quote, to mean the reproduction of labor power alone, and these theorists use the phrase, quote, societal reproduction, end quote, to refer to the reproduction of capitalist society. Contra social reproduction theory, there is no social reproduction without, quote, societal reproduction, end quote, as all production and reproduction in capitalist society are indelibly shaped by accumulation. Incorrect Marxist usage, quote, social reproduction, end quote, refers to the reproduction of society as a whole rather than one element of that society, and when Marxist feminists such as Lise Vogel, Martha Jimenez, and others refer to, quote, social reproduction, end quote. This is the sense in which they use the term. Furthermore, one must identify precisely what sort of society is being produced, as both Vogel, 1983, and Gimenez, 2018, do when they specify capitalist social reproduction. The capitalist class and the working class are inextricably linked to one another via their own processes of production and reproduction. Discussed above with these processes shaped by the imperative of endless accumulation, and together implicated in the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole. Quote, a historically specific form of social production process in general, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. The imperative of accumulation arose out of the historical process of primitive accumulation that divided people in production into these classes. It is this imperative of accumulation as a law of the whole rather than one class or another that ultimately prescribes and constrains the possible actions taken by people, firms, and institutions. Following the convention in classical political economy, starting with Francois Quesnay, whose name is spelled Queusnay, ending with Marx's critique of political economy, in which the capitalist economy is conceived as a system with interconnected parts, I will briefly present a simple model of capitalist society adopted from Munro 2019, in which individual members of the working class and capitalist class each must reproduce themselves to perpetuate their own existence, and in doing so contribute to the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole. Footnote. In this version, the role of the state is largely absent. See Munro 2019 and two pieces from 2021 for discussions of the role of the state in this process. End footnote. Capitalist society is defined here as not just a capitalist division of labor within the so-called, quote, formal economy, end quote, but divisions of labor that compel and constrain the activities of people within society as a whole. These divisions of labor are a consequence of the specific organization of society's productive capacities in capitalism, in which the imperatives of capitalist accumulation ultimately shape institutions and dictate the activities of people. Within the larger social division of labor in capitalist society, there are further divisions of labor within each sector that comprises it. Working-class households must purchase commodities using money from waged work, and combine these commodities with their unwaged labor in order to survive, and are thus reliant on capitalist firms or both these wages and the commodities purchased with these wages. Capitalist firms must purchase labor power, must drive down costs to earn profits from the sale of commodities, and must constantly reinvest these profits to avoid being put out of business by other capitalist firms. Both working-class households and capitalist firms are compelled by the larger structure to act in particular ways to ensure their own survival, and in doing so perpetuate the existence of the whole. The way each class goes about reproducing itself involves mutual reliance on the other class, perpetuating their existences. At the same time as the classes are reliant on one another, each class has interests that are at odds with the others, resulting in conflict. Furthermore, there are tensions within each class as capitalist firms must compete with other capitalist firms for their survival, and workers compete with other workers for their survival. The individual capitalist firm must compete with other firms, both for the supply of workers and in the market selling commodities. The firm does this by driving down cost and by reinvesting profits to perpetuate its own existence. Firms must hire workers to produce commodities, and firms pay wages to the workers that are equal to the value of the commodity labor power. Because the value of the commodity labor power is less than the value of the commodities produced by these workers during the working day, the firm realizes surplus value in the form of profit when the commodities are sold. The market price of labor power is equal to the money price of the commodities used as inputs into the transformation of these commodities into the use values necessary and customary for survival. Though this money price may be higher or lower depending on the portion of the household subsistence provided by inputs from the state and unwaged work of household members, firms contribute to accumulation by purchasing commodities from other firms as inputs into their production process. The firm contributes to social reproduction by remitting payments to the state in the form of taxes. The firm also contributes to social reproduction by paying wages and providing other benefits to workers. who use the money from this wage to buy commodities needed for inputs into the household production process to reproduce labor power. The individual working class household in capitalism contributes to accumulation and is thus implicated in social reproduction in four main ways. First, household members who are compelled to sell part of their time for wages contribute to accumulation because their wage is less than the value produced, thanks to the consumption of their living labor power over the course of the working day. Second, the household is the primary site in which the next generation of workers is raised, providing the future source of labor power. Third, the household purchases commodities as inputs into its household production process, and in doing so, surplus value is realized in the form of profit. Fourth, household members may have additional unwaged work shifted onto them by the firms whom they purchase goods and services without a corresponding decrease in the purchase price of these goods or from the state in the form of volunteer work. The household also contributes to social reproduction by remitting payments to the state in the form of taxes, providing labor to the state in the form of military service, and other employment in the state sector by and reproducing the population. The capitalist process of production is, quote, a historically specific form of the social production process in general. This last is both a production process, I don't know if I said quote. The capitalist production process is, this is a quote from Marx, 1890. It says from 1894, so I'm going to assume that's from Capital Volume 3. Quote, the capitalist process of production is, quote, a historically specific form of the social production process in general. This last is both a production process of the material conditions of existence for human life and a process proceeding in specific economic and historical relations of production. That produces and reproduces these relations of production themselves, and with them the bearers of this process, their material conditions of existence, and their mutual relationships, i.e. the specific economic forms of their society. For the totality of these relationships, which the bearers of this production have toward nature and one another, the relationship in which they produce is precisely society, viewed according to its economic structure. Like all its forerunners, the capitalist production process proceeds under specific material conditions, which are, however, also the bearers of specific social relations which the individuals enter into in the process of reproducing their life. These conditions, like those social relations, are on the one hand the presuppositions of the capitalist production process. On the other, its results and creations. They are both produced by it and reproduced by it. End quote. Marx, 1894. Accumulation and the reproduction of capital cannot be divorced from the reproduction of labor power, and the reproduction of labor power cannot be divorced from the reproduction of capitalist society, nor from the social misery inherent to it. Footnote. It establishes an accumulation of misery, corresponding with accumulation, this is a quote, quote, it establishes an accumulation of misery, corresponding with accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore at the same time, the accumulation of misery, agony, of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, i.e. on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. End footnote. Final section. Conclusion. In correct Marxist usage, social reproduction refers to the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole, a process shaped by the imperative of endless accumulation. While Marx was clear that the reproduction of labor power played a crucial role in this process, Marxist feminists have made important theoretical and empirical contributions to our understanding of precisely how this process is carried out. Along the way, the multiple meanings of reproduction, the reproduction of labor power, the reproduction of capital, and biological reproduction have caused confusion, as the existence of non-Marxist, quote, social reproduction theory, end quote, in the field of education that concerns the integration, transmission of culture and status, I've outlined above a simplified model showing how the reproduction of capitalist society depends on the capitalist continually reproducing himself as capitalist and the worker continually reproducing themselves as a worker, compelled to do so both, quote, physically and socially, end quote. Clark, 1995, as they're each at once produced by the capitalist production process and reproduced by it. The Marxist feminist offshoot, social reproduction theory, has attempted to redefine social reproduction to mean the reproduction of labor power alone, and more recently to redefine social reproduction to mean, quote, life-making, end quote. However, these redefinitions set back our theoretical understanding of capitalist society and the essential role that the reproduction of labor power plays in accumulation and capitalist social reproduction, and how these supposedly virtuous, quote, activities of life-making, end quote, in fact perpetuate the antagonism and social misery inherent to capitalism. So, that's the end of the article. I'm going to read the references, so you can turn this off now if you want to. So I'm just going to say the books that are referenced. K. Allen and B. O'Boyle, 2017, Durkheim, A Critical Introduction. C. Aruza, 2016, Functionalist, Determinist, Reductionist, Social Reproduction, Feminism and Its Critics. M. Barrett, 1980, Women's Oppression Today, The Marxist Feminist Encounter, Verso. Bhattacharya, Introduction, in Bhattacharya's edited volume, Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression. Pierre Bourdieu, 1973, Cultural Production and Social Reproduction, in R. Brown's edited volume, Knowledge, Education, and Social Change. Pierre Bourdieu and J.C. Passeron, 1977, Reproduction in Education, Society, and Culture. J. Brenner, 2000, Women in the Politics of Class. J. Brenner and B. Laslett, 1991, Gender, Social Reproduction, and Women's Self-Organization, Considering the U.S. Welfare State. Simon Clark, 1995, Marx in the Market. C. Cockburn, The Local State, Management of Cities and People, 1977. J. Collins, 2009, Social Reproduction in Classrooms and Schools. Conference of Socialist Economists, 1977, On the Political Economy of Women. I'm going to see if I can look that up. If my internet works, which is probably not going to because I'm outside. But M. Cousins, 1978, Material, Arguments, and Feminism. M. Dalla Costa and Selma James, 1975, The Power of Women and the Subversion of Community. M. H. Desan, 2013, Bourdieu, Marx, and Capital, A Critique of the Extension Model. E. Fergus, 2016, Social Reproduction Ideologies, Teacher Beliefs About Race and Culture. In D.J. Connor, B.A. Ferry, and S.A. Anama, edited volume Discrit, Disability Studies and Critical Race Theory in Education. S. Ferguson, 1999, Building on the Strengths of the Socialist Feminist Tradition. S. Ferguson, 2019, Women in Work, Feminism, Labor, and Social Reproduction. Martha Gimenez, 2018, Marx, Women, and Capitalist Social Reproduction. H. Giraud, Theories of Reproduction and Resistance in the New Sociology of Education, A Critical Analysis. N.Y. Glazer, 1984, Servants to Capital, Unpaid Domestic Labor and Paid Work. N.Y. Glazer, 1993, Women's Paid and Unpaid Labor, the Work Transfer in Healthcare and Retailing. Michael Heinrich, 2012, An Introduction to the Three Volumes of Karl Marx's Capital. S. Jaffa, or Joff, Social Reproduction and the Pandemic with Titi Bhattacharya, Dissent Magazine. Karl Marx, 1867, Capital. Karl Marx, 1894, Capital, Volume 3. M. Miranda, and L. Lane McKinley, 2017, Art Washing or Between Social Practice and Social Reproduction. Kirstin Munro, Social Reproduction Theory and Social Reproduction and Household Production. Kirstin Munro, 2021, The Welfare State in the Bourgeois Family Household. Kirstin Munro, Unproductive Workers and State Repression. Chris O'Kane, 2018, Moishe Pistone's new reading of Marx, The Critique of Political Economy as a Critical Theory of the Historically Specific Social Form of Labor. Moishe Pistone's 1993, Time, Labor, and Social Domination. P. Quick, Labor, I think it's Patty Quick, I'm not sure. Labor Power, a quote, peculiar, end quote, commodity. S. Rao, S. Ram Narain, S. Naidu, A. Upal, and A. Mukherjee. Work in Social Reproduction in Rural India, Lessons from Time Use Data. David Ricardo, 1817, On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. A. Sears, 2016, Situating Sexuality and Social Reproduction. A. Sears, Body Politics, The Social Reproduction of Sexualities, in Bhattacharya's edited volume, Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression. M. Thompson, 2020, Sounding the Arcane, Contemporary Music, Gender, and Reproduction. Lise Vogel, 1981, Marxism and Feminism, Unhappy Marriage, Trial Separation, or Something Else, in L. Sargent's edited volume, Women and Revolution, a discussion of the unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism. Lise Vogel, 1983, Marxism and the Oppression of Women Toward a Unitary Theory, republished in 2013. I. Young, 1981, Beyond the Unhappy Marriage, a critique of the dual systems theory, in L. Sargent's edited volume, Women and Revolution, a discussion of the unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism, Montreal Black Rose Books. All right. We're done. Thank you for listening.